On September 1, 1939, a 58-year-old career officer stood in a quiet office in Washington and took the oath to become Chief of Staff of the United States Army. On the other side of the Atlantic, at almost that exact hour, German tanks were crossing the Polish border. World War II had just started, and the army this man had just been handed to defend his country was smaller than the army of Portugal, smaller than Bulgaria's, ranked by most counts somewhere around 17th in the world, tied roughly with Romania. Within 6 years, that army would grow to more than 8 million men, equipped, trained, shipped across 2 oceans, and thrown into the 2 largest theaters of combined arms warfare in human history. So, how did one man, with almost no public profile, no political base, and a Congress that refused to even say the word war, build the most powerful fighting force the world had ever seen, essentially from scratch? This is the story of George C. Marshall and the quiet, ruthless, almost invisible machine he built to win a war most Americans did not yet believe they were going to fight. To understand how unlikely this was, you have to understand what the U.S. Army actually looked like in the summer of 1939. It had roughly 174,000 men. Its tanks were mostly obsolete relics from the First World War. Soldiers, sometimes trained with wooden replicas of machine guns and trucks, painted with the word tank, because there weren't enough real ones to go around. Isolationism was not a fringe position in America in 1939. It was the dominant mood of the country. Memories of the trenches of the First World War were still raw, and the idea of sending American boys to fight in another European conflict was, to most voters and most members of Congress, simply unacceptable. Any officer who wanted to expand the army, modernize its equipment, or prepare seriously for a war against Germany or Japan was going to have to do it while pretending, in public, that no such war was coming. Marshall himself was, on paper, an unlikely candidate to be the man who solved that problem. He had not gone to West Point. He had graduated from the Virginia Military Institute, a credential that, in the tightly networked, West Point-dominated culture of the interwar army, marked him as something of an outsider for his entire career. What he had instead was a reputation, built quietly over 3 decades, for being extraordinarily good at moving large numbers of men and material without wasting a single day. In the First World War, as a staff officer under General John J. Pershing, Marshall had planned and executed the movement of roughly 600,000 American troops for the Meuse-Argonne offensive in a matter of days, an operation so complex that Pershing later called him the finest organizer the Army had ever produced. But the reveal doesn't come from the battlefield. It comes from what Marshall did in the 2 decades of peace that followed. Through the 1920s and 1930s, while the Army shrank, underfunded and largely ignored, Marshall taught at the Army War College and helped reform infantry training at Fort Benning. And quietly, without any official mandate to do so, he began keeping a private notebook. Historians would later call it his Black Book. In it, Marshall recorded the names of promising younger officers he encountered, men whose talent stood out even in a peacetime army that rewarded seniority over ability. Names like Dwight Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, Matthew Ridgway. Nobody asked Marshall to keep this list. He kept it anyway, for 15 years, because he already suspected that when the real test came, the officer corps sitting at the top of the army by seniority would not be the officer corps capable of winning a modern war. In 1938, Marshall got the meeting that changed everything. As Deputy Chief of Staff, He was in the Oval Office when President Franklin Roosevelt laid out an ambitious rearmament plan focused almost entirely on aircraft production. One by one, the officials in the room nodded along in agreement. Then Roosevelt turned to Marshall and asked if he agreed too. Marshall said no. He told the president, in front of everyone, that the plan was unbalanced and incomplete. It was the kind of answer that could end a career. Roosevelt's advisors reportedly assumed Marshall had just finished himself professionally. Instead, Roosevelt remembered it. 14 months later, when it came time to select the next Army Chief of Staff, Roosevelt passed over more senior generals and chose the one man who had told him something he didn't want to hear. What Marshall inherited on September 1, 1939, was, in effect, an impossible assignment. Build an army capable of fighting a global, industrialized war, while the country funding it insisted loudly and repeatedly that it had no intention of fighting one. His first major move was to push for something the United States had never done in peacetime: a draft. The Selective Training and Service Act passed Congress in September 1940, registering millions of American men for potential military service, a full 15 months before Pearl Harbor. But the draft Marshall built the Army on very nearly did not survive to see the war it was preparing for. By the summer of 1941, the original terms of the draft were set to expire. Isolationist sentiment in Congress had not gone away. If the extension failed, the army that Marshall had spent 2 years building would begin sending its draftees home, dismantling itself just months before the country would need every one of them. On August 12, 1941, the extension passed the House of Representatives by a single vote, 203 to 202. If 2 members had voted differently, the United States would have entered December of 1941 in the process of disbanding its own army. While Marshall fought that battle in Congress, he was fighting a quieter, more brutal one inside the army itself. He forced out dozens of senior officers he judged too old, too slow, or too tied to outdated doctrine to lead a modern war, regardless of rank or reputation. It made him deeply unpopular among the Army's old guard. It also cleared the path for the names in his Black Book. Eisenhower, a lieutenant colonel with no combat command experience in 1939, would be a 4-star general commanding the largest amphibious invasion in history within 5 years. That was not luck. That was 15 years of quiet observation, cashed in exactly when it mattered. If you're finding the sheer scale of what Marshall was building fascinating, this is exactly the kind of overlooked machinery behind the big, famous battles that we dig into every week. Now, once Pearl Harbor removed any question of whether America was going to war, the entire apparatus Marshall had spent 2 years assembling in secret switched on all at once. Training camps that had been built on a hunch now filled past capacity. War production, coordinated through the industrial mobilization plans Marshall had pushed for years earlier, began turning out tanks, aircraft and ships at a rate no other nation on Earth could match. The numbers that resulted from this are almost difficult to process. The U.S. Army grew from 174,000 men in 1939 to more than 8.3 million by 1945. It fought simultaneously across the Pacific and Europe, coordinated with Allied command structures on multiple continents, and never once ran out of trained men to send. Winston Churchill would later call Marshall the organizer of victory, and it was not an exaggeration. But the story of Marshall has a final twist that most people never hear, and it is, in its own way, the most human part of this entire account. By 1944, everyone in Washington, including Roosevelt himself, assumed that Marshall would be given command of Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. It was the obvious reward for everything he had built. Marshall wanted it. He never said so directly, because that was not how Marshall operated, but everyone around him understood that after 5 years of building an army from nothing, in an office in Washington, he wanted the chance to actually lead it into the fight he had spent his whole career preparing for. Roosevelt changed his mind at the last possible moment. He told Marshall, according to multiple accounts, that he did not feel he could sleep at ease with Marshall out of the country. The command went instead to Eisenhower, the officer Marshall himself had quietly identified and promoted years before anyone else saw what he was capable of. Marshall never publicly complained. He accepted the decision, stayed in Washington, and kept running the machine that made the invasion possible in the first place. The man who built the army that won the war did not get to lead it into its most famous battle. After the war, Marshall did not retire quietly. He became Secretary of State and designed the European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan, that rebuilt a shattered continent and helped prevent the economic collapse that many feared would hand Western Europe to communism. In 1953, he became the first career soldier in history to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And in 1951, at the height of his reputation, Senator Joseph McCarthy stood on the floor of the Senate and accused Marshall, the man who had built the army that defeated Hitler, of being part of what McCarthy called a conspiracy so immense it had betrayed the country from within. Marshall said almost nothing in his own defense. He simply kept working. He died in 1959. At his request, there were no eulogies at his funeral, no speeches about his accomplishments, just a short, simple service for a man who had spent his entire career building the machinery for other people to become famous in. The 8-million-man army that crossed 2 oceans and won a war on 2 fronts existed because a quiet outsider from WWII spent 15 years writing names in a notebook nobody asked him to keep, and then had the discipline to actually use it when the moment came. If this story changed how you think about who actually wins wars, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me which name from Marshall's Black Book surprised you the most.